The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Okay, well, why don't we get started? What we're going to talk about for the next hour or so is experience in leading change in a rather large, complex organization. And I had the great opportunity to do that at Rolls-Royce in Indianapolis in the years from 2000 to 2004, and then I retired. Came here, I like academia and I like the lean business overall. Just as you've seen in the other presentations today, we're going to talk about, from Dick Lewis's perspective, what are the key components which drive enterprise improvement. We'll talk about a number of the essential tools for business improvement to kind of flesh out the list that you saw earlier. I'll show you some metrics that we used at Rolls-Royce for communicating with the workforce how we were doing. And then I hope that you will agree that improvement is a process. It goes on and on, not an end state at all. So Rolls-Royce in Indianapolis belonged to General Motors for many, many years. And it has a long history of producing engines for a wide variety of aircraft. At one point in time, I could claim that we were the only engine manufacturer that operated on all 7 continents, because the reprovisioning in those days of the Antarctic missions was all done with C-130s. Some unique product families, lots of customers, and lots of engines in service, which meant that there was a business not only in new engines but also in spare parts. The company was really hidden in the round-off era of General Motors, and allowed to innovate and reinvest and not behave particularly businesslike. So it was spun off by General Motors in 1992 to a leveraged buyout firm, and then subsequently resold to Rolls-Royce in 1995. And what Rolls-Royce inherited was a company with great products, good customers, lots of excellent technology, but a company that didn't know how to make money. So that was somewhat of a problem. It's a fairly complex company with many business sectors, several different product families which are completely different physically. And the volume of operations was on the order of 2 engines every day, and about $1 million of parts, which in hundreds of dollars each is a lot of parts every day. Fairly good-sized workforce, half of which were unionized in an inherited United Auto Workers Union from General Motors. A large old factory that was built during World War II with many obsolete pieces of equipment, and a good-sized business. $1.5 billion worth of sales is not at all bad. So what we're going to look at is the story between 2000 and 2004 or 5, which was our lean journey. Now, as we said earlier today, every enterprise has many stakeholders. And in fact, if you even think, because those of us who fly on regional jets are also stakeholders, because we're flying customers on those regional jets that are powered by the Rolls-Royce engines. But there are thousands of pilots and maintainers and other users of the airplanes. There's lots of customers that buy them. There are a number of partners. We found ourselves partnering in some instances with General Electric and other instances with Pratt & Whitney. And then lots of employees. We had dealt with our supplier network actually just a little bit before I took over, but having had thousands of suppliers and then gotten that down to about 300 by some consolidation and some tiering of suppliers. It turns out that governments are also key stakeholders, not only the federal government because they fund the military engine purchases, but states because they're concerned about stable employment and taxes that are paid, and the same thing is true of local governments. And then you go down to the community, and they're concerned about noise and pollution and traffic in their neighborhoods and so on and so forth. Finally, it's obvious that the stakeholders of Rolls-Royce the shareholders are very big stakeholders as well, as was the union. So a lot of different constituents, all of whom you had to consider as you were implementing change. Now, in my opinion, and this is extracted from going a lot of places, reading a lot of things, listening to some very bright people, but in my opinion, the first and foremost thing that one has to have if you're going to implement change is a vision of where you want to be. And that has to be simply and clearly articulated to everyone in the organization so that there can be buy-in and subscription to that. You have to focus on your customers and on your employees. Of course, the other stakeholders too, but the customers are so important because they are the people who buy from you and allow you to pay your payroll. Active leadership and involvement with the workforce is absolutely key. You know, I spent hours and hours in our factory and in our offices as a part of my everyday routine. Every week I sent an email to all employees. Every time there was a major issue that we had to deal with, we would gather people together and talk across the company and communicate. You have to be willing to change things because a lot of what we do is because we've always done it that way, and that's not necessarily the best way to do things. You must have trained, empowered, and in my opinion, incentivized employees. A constancy of improvement activity and a way to celebrate and reward success. So, our vision was taken from Rolls-Royce PLC, the British parent. It's called Trusted to Deliver Excellence. But that's a rather abstract term, you know. What does it mean? Perhaps if you were schooled in the UK, it would come very naturally. But to a Midwestern United States workforce in Indianapolis, Indiana, we translated it and we said, okay, it's determined by customer satisfaction first and foremost, measured by a few understandable metrics, supported by a workforce that's trained and empowered to deliver the improvement, and across the entire business. So that was our translation of our vision, and that was what drove us in everything that we did. Now, I will tell you that there have been just a few really key leaders who have led their organizations with a constancy of improvement over a long period of time. And the first we talked about this morning was John Galvin, who brought Six Sigma into Motorola. Jack Welch then amplified on that and actually built an entire business philosophy around being number one or number two in the businesses, working out your problems, developing wonderful leadership training, and using Six Sigma. So those things happened over a long period of time at General Electric. Larry Bossy actually was an alum of General Electric, and then Lou Giuliano on here, who was my boss at ITT for a number of years, worked for Bossity. So as you can see, that whole clan came out of General Electric, kind of interesting, as did Jim McNerney. Clay Jones, on the other hand, at Rockwell Collins, is a completely different animal. He was a naval aviator. And subscribed early to Lean and truly is a full spectrum visionary leader. Now, you don't do this without knowledge. That's why training courses such as this are really essential. And there's two components that we talk about here. We talked about the Six Sigma with capable world-class processes, and we talked about Lean with streamlined value-adding activity focused on the customer. So at Rolls-Royce, what we did is we actually used a hierarchy of knowledge delivery. The first thing that we did was teach people how to work in teams. That is not something that people often have in their background, and successful team working is really key. Now, I was very impressed by the way that you have worked together here in this class. So something's happening right here at MIT, but that's not always the case. So then once we had the team and the leadership skills ingrained in the workforce, we selectively trained people at various levels of competency in Lean and Six Sigma. A few people become black belts, which is really about the highest level you'll find in large proportion. But there are a few people who really have certified mastery, typically only a handful in a big company. You go into Boeing and there's 4 or 5 who I would say are really certified masters. And then finally, rarely and hardly ever do you find people who are so knowledgeable about Lean and Six Sigma that they truly become teachers or sensei in Japanese. One of them was at Pratt & Whitney for many years, Mr. Ito, and they named the Ito University after him, which is their executive training facility in Hartford. We had Dr. Junichi Taguchi, who you may be familiar with from the design of experiments work that he led. So the hierarchy of knowledge is very key. Now, the knowledge then is typically structured around what we now call domaic. This is kind of the natural evolution of the old Deming cycle, but now has a 5th component. So we talk about defining the problem, measuring the situation, analyzing the data, improving the situation, and then finally controlling it. So domaic is a virtuous cycle, and it has many, many components embedded within it. So let's talk about those on the next several charts. So on define, we do such things as doing a process map like you've done today and define the problems. You haven't got to that yet, but you will as you turn that into a value stream map. Putting metrics on them, which you've done. You've taken the basic metrics for the process map and then setting some improvement goals. Well, it's implicit in the Sasha and Andy exercise that they would like to have more customers. So, if they're going to do that, what are they going to do? How are they going to change their cycle time, which is far too long, to meet the takt time desires of 75 or even 100 customers? So having done that, then we measure, and by analyzing each component of the process, we put data on it. You put things like time, inventory levels, the amount of rework, the cycle time, all of those things. You can, in some instances, apply probability and statistics to those if it's not a clearly closed form issue. Like for example, the cleanup. I mean, is there that's kind of a probabilistic issue because you don't know when you're going to do it. Data collection and analysis, and having the right kinds of measurement systems so that you can determine process capability. Analysis, there are many tools, and those of you who may go on to pursue green belts or black belts in Lean and Six Sigma will be exposed to a lot of these things. Perhaps the best body of knowledge that exists along these lines is supported by the American Society of Quality. They have a large manual that goes into all of this in detail, and they have also web courses that you can take to learn how to do each of those. And then in terms of the improvement, the things that we usually find are we do what's our Kaizen or burst type exercises where you get all of the knowledgeable people together in a room to work and solve a problem. If it's more of a intellectual issue, you can use design of experiments or Taguchi methods and so on. And then finally, under control, Earl just showed you a number of things on Visual Factory and andons. We talked this morning about Kanbans. Muda is waste. You want to eliminate Muda. Poka-yoking is fool-proofing or mistake-proofing, and you want to do that. And we talked about 5S or 6S. And finally, total productive maintenance is maintenance that's keyed to the signal that you get from the equipment that you're using, so that as you see it drifting away from a desired state, you do the maintenance then as required, as opposed to just having every 3 months you do maintenance. So these are some of the essential tools, and these are tools that we trained our people. Now, I'm a believer personally in a few simple metrics. This morning before I came over here, we were meeting with Raytheon, and they actually have an executive in their corporate staff who maintains a set of metrics for the CEO. He has about 15. The problem that you have when you have that many metrics is that not everybody can understand them. And it's hard to danced or marched to 15 different drum beats. It's a little bit confusing. So what we did is we used the voice of the customer being both the external customer and also the internal customer, to help us define the most important shareholder issues. And so in our case, it was on-time delivery. Was really, we were struggling to meet on-time delivery because it was the beginning of the regional jet business, and the customer demand was very, very high. And you know, we were trying to ramp up production. So that was a problem for us. We had several supplier-related problems with our delivered product quality, the worst of which was the electronic fuel control on the engines, which were built by Lucas in the UK, and they suffered from a rash of false diagnostic messages that were, you know, they said that there was something wrong with the fuel control, but there really wasn't anything wrong with the fuel control. But that drives the airline customer crazy. So we had to deal with that. We had in our own factory first pass test yields. We were having to go back and rework and retest too many of our engines, and it was also compromising our on-time delivery and our cost of non-quality. In our finance organization, we had simply never addressed the issue of collecting money from people who owed it to us. And we had, you know, in the year 2000, I think we closed the year with $50 million of past due receivables. And you know, that may sound like a small amount of money for a $1.5 billion company, but the fact of the matter is the way our financial structure was organized, we had to pay 10% interest on that $50 million, which means I lost $5 million of potential profit because of those uncollected receivables. And then finally, we used the standard parameter that I showed on the chart this morning of return on invested capital. That's a little bit more abstract and hard to talk about with the employees, but we were able to emphasize that the invested capital included all of this inventory that we have in the factory, and you know, the work in process and the engines that we couldn't deliver because they didn't pass the tests. So we concentrated really on the denominator of the return on invested capital. The pricing, what the customer pays, controls the numerator. That's harder for us to control, but we could control the denominator. What it showed is that we had a continuum of initiatives over time, including membership in the Lean Aerospace Initiative. But what we did is we started in areas where there was low-hanging fruit. So we started with some of our factory cleanup. We started with working with our suppliers. Then as we got a little bit more mature and had more people trained, then we started cross-training our workforce so that they had more Lean and Six Sigma skills. And in our unionized workforce, we actually multi-skill trained people, aiming at changing the contract with the union in the future. And then we gradually added third-party part suppliers and outsourced some of the stuff that it didn't make sense for us to do because our average labor cost was very high. Okay, so here we are. It's the year 2000. My predecessor had been fired because the company lost $50 million, and he didn't know it, and the CEO didn't like that. So I got drafted actually to do this. I was happily running the defense side of our business, but having done this sort of stuff at ITT and elsewhere in the past, they said, you got to do this for us. So I agreed. And the first thing we did was try to mobilize the leadership team. I had about 15 or so direct reports that covered all the functions in the organization. So we got together and we spent some time agreeing on the vision, setting priorities for the company, establishing the metrics, reassigning some key people. For example, the number 2 design engineer was reassigned to run the engine assembly. And that sounds like a strange transition, but indeed, it was absolutely key. I had to fire the controller because he was part of the financial problem, and we got in a new controller who knew which way was up. And then I took the number 1 civil aviation salesman and put him in charge of supplier relations. So, you know, there were some changes that were, you know, deliberate in their intent in order to try to put stronger people in some of the key jobs that we really had to do. We focused on data. Everything that we tried to do, we tried to have data to do that. And we started making early investments to deal with some of the roadblocks that we had. And so back to the question this morning about how quickly can you make change, there was a lot of things that were happening that could be significantly improved. And indeed, we got wonderful results in the first year. But much of that is because the results before the first year were so absolutely horrible. But we made improvements in on-time delivery and in quality. We got our first pass test yields moving in the right direction. The cost of nonconformance improvement by 3% may sound like a small number, but the gross number was $150 million. So it was real money. We went through the factory with a vengeance, and anything that wasn't being used, we sent off to the scrap metal dealers. We worked hard with our government customer to deal with the processes of closing out government contracts. In the finance area, they looked at the complexity of our financial accounting and were able to eliminate about a quarter of that. And so as a consequence, we turned the financial picture around in a year. And we were also, I was very fortunate that Rolls-Royce allowed us to actually provide incentive compensation to everybody in the company. Now, there was incentive compensation for the union members. That was bargained into their contract. But Rolls-Royce very astutely understood that if we couldn't include everybody from the secretaries to the the leaders in the various test areas and all, that it wouldn't work. So we were able to do that. Now, stability is important when you're implementing change, and so we were conscious of the need to be consistent. We reaffirmed the first year's actions, but we then started on some new things. This year it was time to figure out how to deal with those overdue receivables. So we set up a cash collection team. And it was really amazing. It turns out that there are a lot of organizations in this world, including the bill payers that are hounding us these days, who really have a process for collecting cash. And what we did is we trained our finance and accounting people using those models, and it began to come together very well. We also recognized it took too long to assemble engines, and we were doing it in a one-at-a-time basis, so we began an investment in a flow line which allowed the engine to be built from the compressor all the way up through the end as it flowed down a line. And whereas it used to take 30 days to assemble an engine, our goal was 10 days. We hired a third-party parts supplier, somebody to actually control all the nuts, bolts, and screws and little things. It was silly for us to manage those, so we hired actually UPS, and they purchased them to our specs, warehoused them for us, and then delivered them to us in can vans. And training, of course, and working with suppliers. So in the second year, the momentum was there. I mean, the employees really bought into this. They were being told how they did. Every week they knew, every month they knew the financial performance. And so now, we're getting almost okay on-time delivery. And we've reduced the cost of nonconformance by 10% now. Read $15 million, it's real money. Got the delinquent receivables down from 50 million to 25, we're headed down, and delivered record cash and profit to Rolls-Royce. So again, we were able to reward our employees, and the typical reward was about 10% of their salary. So that was, that's meaningful when you get more than a month's pay. The third years, we did some work fine-tuning priorities, and particularly we're working on simplifying the way we operated in the factory. Our historical labor contract was the typical complicated mess that's driven the U.S. automotive business into the ground. Literally, we had 100 different job categories, and no one could do work out of their job category. So if you were a receiving person in the incoming material dock, that's what you did. You could not then deliver that material to the shop floor, or you couldn't even work on the outgoing dock and send it out, even though the work was exactly the same. If you were working, nothing could move in the factory without using material handlers. So these guys, they had a racket. They drove around all day in their bicycles and their forklifts, and it was very little value added. I mean, in the lean sense, it was just horrible. Our strategy was to cross-train people so they could do multiple jobs, and then to bargain subsequently with the union to eliminate some of those job categories and simplify the way work was done in the factory. So that was the reason for that emphasis there. We completed the flow line. It was really amazing. The Duke of York came to dedicate the flow line, and you can imagine what excitement there was to have a British royalty coming in, and he's a very handsome fellow anyway. They just absolutely went wild. It was fantastic. We started tearing down stuff we didn't need because it costs money to heat and light and insure and all the other stuff. And I talked about our third-party logistics. The transactional black belts thing was an experiment. There's various places you can do this. We used the George Group, which was a very successful consulting firm in Texas that I had worked with, to train about a dozen of our people in finance and in human relations and in legal and all those other areas, and it really worked well. I also used them. I forced all of my direct reports to live through a 3-day Lean Academy, so we did that too. So the results would have been spectacular, except that we had 9/11, and that was a real challenge for us because we knew that although there was backlog in work, that we knew that the orders for the following years would be greatly reduced. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how best to respond to that. And the whole company, actually, in the UK and the US, we all had the same issue here. So we spent about 2 months before we actually took any decisive actions, because we wanted to think it through and really understand what the consequences of this would be, because we wanted to emerge after the aftermath of 9/11 as strong as we had been going in. The other thing that I did is, along with the president of our local union, we addressed every single employee on every shift, I think about 3 times. First of all, saying what we knew and what we didn't know, and then talking about how were we going to try to deal with it. And the way we dealt with it was by offering incentivized early retirements. We had a number of retirement eligible people, and we also, in the union, they have what they call buyouts. So for younger people who thought that they could make a career change, we would offer them a lump sum of cash. So there were very few involuntary separations of that. So it was handled well. We had, it was handled as humanely as it could be. So as a consequence, in here, with the downturn in volume, we saw some of our metrics actually improve, because if you're not making things, the cost of non-quality is going to go down. But at the same time, we were still satisfying our customers, and we have got our wonderful world-class engine cycle time now, and we delivered significant cash and profit, and people did get incentive compensation. So those were good results. In the 4th year, we needed to still work on quality, and we were closing in on a new labor contract. So we completed the shop floor multi-training, and we finished off on some of our Kanban activities and our factory modernization, and I retired. That had always been a plan. I wanted to work something like 45 years, and that was about where it was. And it was time to go on and do something else. So they changed me, but the vision didn't change, and the organization had momentum. And so as a consequence, there were continued improvements in on-time deliveries. The quality and non-quality were pretty static. We lost our quality lead, which was really a problem. She left for personal reasons. And so we got good customer satisfaction and basically continued the journey that we had been doing for the last 4 years. So in the 5th year then, all the energies of the company, now I'm gone, but all the energies of the company were focused on this contract with the United Auto Workers. The reason why this was so important for Rolls-Royce is that our competitors have much easier to live with unions, like the machinists union. You know, the UAW is really a tough union. I mean, they and the Teamsters are probably the hardest to deal with, but they're also very smart. And, you know, so we did negotiate a breakthrough contract. We eliminated a lot of the unnecessary job categories. We, you know, actually provided more compensation to our employees because they had multiple skills and they were worth more. So that was great, but it was a distraction. And then we had, after the contract was signed, then the operations guy got transferred back to England. The manufacturing guy got a great job down in Georgia. And the quality lady that I talked about left because she had a death in her family, and it was very sad. So that, that did cause some loss of momentum. And, you know, but there were good results that year. I mean, the contract allowed them, and it was a 4-year contract also, so long-term sustainability. The metrics continue to be established. They've won a joint contract with General Electric for the engine, for the alternate engine for the Joint Strike Fighter, and again, got incentive compensation. Now that's 2005, and people always ask me, well, what's happened since then? And what's happened since then is that there have been more good things happen. There is certainly the focus on lean manufacturing operation. They're working on lean product development activities. They're very lean in their finance activities. They've been able to invest in a new light helicopter engine. You may know that the most successful new training helicopter is made by a company called Robinson, the R-22, and they're coming out with a turbine-powered version of that, which will be exclusively a Rolls-Royce Model 300 engine, which is very good news too. There's some bad news. They've drifted away from LAI, and I was very sad, very disappointed about that. But on balance, things have gone pretty well. Now, when you go to lean, there are lots of other beneficial changes, and what this chart captures is the enormous volume of paperwork that was existing before we started to do lean. And, you know, by eliminating so many of these things which turn out to not be necessary, you free up people's resources to do important work. And so, you know, I don't want to go through all of these in detail, but I can tell you that it was a very major sea-state change, which allowed us then to, you know, focus on better product development, better customer support, better manufacturing activities, and good profitability, et cetera. So if you try to capture these things on a kind of input-output, in the input we increased the employee training every year. It's really important. And we transitioned to a multi-skilled workforce, which allowed us to change the union contract. Modernized over 50% of the facilities, and our employees were empowered to earn significant incentive compensation. In the output area, our cycle times were reduced by more than 2/3. Inventory turns better than 40% better. The cost of non-quality halved. On-time deliveries to benchmark levels. Customer satisfaction improved by 50%. World-class cash collection. Earl, you had a question.
Yeah, can you explain what inventory turn is?
Inventory turn is a ratio of the inventory that you have on hand and the time that it takes to liquidate that particular amount of inventory. So you talk about in like days of inventory, a spacecraft will have 300 or 400 days of inventory before they actually liquidate that inventory and sell a spacecraft. Toyota has hours of inventory because it's hours from the time that they get the material and to the time that they deliver the car. So those are inventory turns. Okay? All right, so benefits to Rolls-Royce. When I took over, our primary customer at Embraer, the regional jet maker, wouldn't even talk to us in Indianapolis. They refused to talk to us there. They would only go to the UK and talk to our super bosses. We fixed that. We reversed a mediocre cash collection and finance performance, secured future lines of business like the Joint Strike Fighter engine and the new helicopter engine. And the best practices that we evolved, like the flow line, like the cash collection activity, like the customer, like the supplier, third-party supplier stuff, that was all then translated to the UK and is in use there now. So that's great. And that's the wonderful thing about a large corporation, is that the best benchmarking is internal benchmarking. Now there are barriers, there were barriers. We had lots of underground resistance and skepticism, and you will hear this whenever you're put in charge of change management. And people are comfortable with the way things are, so you know, it's easier to not change, but you have to deal with that. And the way we dealt with it is we very clearly had a burning platform. This is a term you'll find in a number of the books on lean, and they say, well, if you're on an oil platform and it's burning, you know you've got to do something. Well, our burning platform were, you know, intense customer dissatisfaction, absolutely horrible financial performance, and the very real risk that if we didn't get our act together, that Rolls-Royce could close the whole operation in Indianapolis and move the work elsewhere in the world. And so, not wanting that to happen, we had three very compelling arguments to do better. You have to work to get the buy-in, and you know that's why we started with the leadership team and then distributed, and they had to do that. We used policy deployment to flow down objectives into every organization. Communication, it is impossible to communicate too much. You just have to do it all the time, and you have to be consistent, and you have to target your communication so that you know that it's getting to the right people and that they are understanding it. You know, question and make sure that what you're saying is being understood. You have to dispatch some resistance, usually not too very much. In most corporate environments, the resistance is somewhat passive, and people will modify their behavior if they know they have to. It's a little less that way in government and in academia. I've worked in all those areas as well. But we did reassign several people away from things they wanted to do, and there were a number of people who left the company to go do something else. But finally, and this really comes from years of watching the Malcolm Baldrige process, which is a U.S. Initiative to encourage industrial excellence headed out of the National Institute for Standards and Technology in Washington. And in all the Baldrige examples that I can remember, there was always rewarding or celebrating success. And whether it's Canon sending people from their factory in Williamsburg, Virginia to a quality symposium in Japan, or Milliken carpet makers in South Carolina having a giant picnic for all the employees, or whether it was us sending teams to the UK for our annual quality conferences, recognition and rewards are very important. And I think we would have made some progress without the ability to financially stimulate the activity, but it certainly is very helpful. Okay, so observations. Finally, this is a journey. This is a 5-year journey, and it continues. You find that business conditions do change along the way, and they force you to adapt. But as long as you have a constancy of leadership intent, as long as the leadership is in agreement that change to improve customer satisfaction and business performance is essential, then that helps to deal with all the changes in business conditions and changes with your competitors, because you know your competitors are getting better all the time as well. So staying still is really not an option. The better you get, the more there is to do. So with that, I'd like to ask you if you have any questions, and I'll try to answer them. Okay. The question is, what is the difference, if you will, between the various levels of competency and knowledge in Lean and Six Sigma? And I mentioned yellow belts, green belts, black belts, and master black belts. Basically, it's the amount of knowledge and experience that you have. So, you know, a class like this would probably qualify as a yellow belt. You know, to become a green belt, you really ought to work on a project or two applying these principles. To become a black belt, you have to lead projects which produce tangible results. And typically, most companies require hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings to be demonstrated before they would affirm that that's a black belt. Master black belt's higher than that. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. One of the first observations you made was that, you know, your early benefits from implementing improvement are, you know, significant. And then there seems to be a diminishing return as you keep working on the same thing over time. And that's true. But what happens is that in any organization, you can only deal with, you know, certain processes at a time because you don't have enough resources to deal with it. So, you know, when you reach an acceptable level with you know, say a process, then if you look adjacent to that, you'll find other opportunities for dramatic improvement as well. So it's possible to keep momentum going for a long time. Now, you also raised the issue about it's more fun to create new processes than it is to be the maintainer of processes. And that's an issue that we have, especially with creative people like engineers. You know, but the way that some companies deal with that is that they actually have what they call process councils. And at Boeing, at Rolls-Royce, you have process ownership councils, so that, for example, the people who do preliminary design have a process council, and they work across the company to, you know, share, you know, best practice, to share problems and issues, and then to, you know, develop and evolve the body of knowledge that is associated with that particular set of processes. So, you know, it is important to have a process owner. It's important to sustain attention on that because otherwise they can drift away. And the question is, you know, if you are too structured and focused on improvement activities, does that stifle creativity? I don't really think so, but the way that we dealt with it is that we set aside pockets of our company that were specifically chartered to be creative. So, for example, we had an organization that is kind of like the Lockheed Skunk Works that was there to focus on very advanced, far-out engine concepts. We had, I had a group of people who were just entirely focused on innovating new factory models. So there were pockets of creativity surrounded by stable, process-oriented activity that paid the bills. Okay. You know, certainly 9/11 was the most challenging. The most rewarding is seeing people succeed after having, you know, grown and evolved in their skills and capabilities. So that, you know, I had many people that I worked with who went on to other leadership positions in Rolls-Royce, and that's great. That makes you feel so good. Yes, we did. And what we had was there was an announced formula that said that, you know, depending upon the amount of success, financial success that the company had, then there was a sliding scale. And in the case of the whole employee incentive pool, it went, I mean, it could be zero if we didn't meet our goals. If we met our goals, they would get a 5% of their normal compensation, and if we exceeded the goals by like 100%, they could get up as much as 10%. So it was on a sliding scale. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure.
If you couldn't use something like
If I couldn't, okay, what would I do? All right. If I couldn't do something like that, then I would go fight with my human resources department to budget for, if you will, basically non-salary type compensation, so award type money. And I would use that, but also I use, and we did anyway, we used a lot of recognition. So, you know, people who did good things, you know, were paraded in front of the leadership of the company and, you know, got to speak at our management meetings and got introduced to the CEO and all that kind of stuff. We you know, whenever the chairman of Rolls-Royce would come to Indianapolis, and it was 2 or 3 times a year, you know, we would parade him around to areas that were doing good work and, you know, introduce the people and talk about, you know, why that was important for the company. And then we did, within Rolls-Royce, we had an annual quality conference in the UK, and we would send 2 or 3 teams of people, so maybe as many as 20 people would go to the UK for a week and listen to, they'd make presentations, and they'd also listen to other people from all over the world doing that. So, you know, you need a combination. Cash is important because it helps pay bills. But you know, the personal recognition and you know, acknowledgement of having done good things is very key. We did use what's called various terms of management policy deployment. And so every one of my leadership team was obliged to mirror the activities that we were taking at the top of the company in their own organization. So it would vary from you know, place to place. In engineering, it might have, I think they actually made more changes in engineering than we did in the civil airline business, for example. So it depended upon the individual department. Okay. And you know, I would recommend Collins's book, Good to Great. It's an excellent review of the attributes of highly successful companies, and, you know, not